The cormorants knew before anyone asked them. That was the thing about birds. They didn't file reports. They didn't hold meetings. They didn't consult models or wait for peer review. They simply responded to what the water was doing, and if you had been watching them long enough, you understood that their behavior was the most honest environmental assessment available. Rowan Hatch had been watching them for 28 years. He worked this bay from a small boat, diving for Dungeness crab and doing light commercial crab work during the season, running the same ground his father had fished until the salmon stopped coming and the permit stopped being worth holding. His father had given up his commercial salmon permit in 2003, the last member of a fleet that had once been the center of this community's identity. He'd kept his crab license and his logs, and the particular quietness of a man who had watched something he loved disappear and had decided not to talk about it constantly. Rowan had the salmon logs. His father had kept them from 1967 forward. Catch records, water conditions, timing observations, the kind of documentation that a commercial fisherman produced because it was useful, not because anyone told him to, not because he had any sense that they would be needed by anyone else. Simply because you fished a body of water seriously for 40 years. You paid attention. And paying attention without writing it down felt like letting the observation disappear before it served its purpose. Those logs were in a wooden drawer under the workbench in the garage, stored with no particular care beyond keeping them dry, because his father had been a practical man who kept practical things. Rowan also had his own dive logs, going back to 1996. Visibility, bottom condition, water temperature, what he found at depth and where the state of the substrate in specific locations across the bay. 28 years of what the bay looked like from below, written in the handwriting of a man who had started as a recreational diver and had eventually understood that recording what he saw was a form of paying rent. The ongoing contribution of someone who was using a bay's resources and wanted to leave something behind besides the evidence of his own harvest. The cormorant colony at the rocky point near the bay's entrance had always numbered between 800 and 1,000 birds during peak season. He had been counting them since his second year on this water, not out of any scientific intention, but because his father had pointed them out and said, "Those birds are the bay's fishing report. Count them if you want to know how the bay is doing." He had counted them every season since. The Mussel farm arrived with good intentions, and Rowan understood that. The aquaculture expansion program was real. The need was real. The community had genuinely lost something when the salmon fleet collapsed, and a mussel farm was not an unreasonable response to the question of how a coastal community rebuilt an economy around sustainable protein. The long lines went into the water the spring of Rowan's 62nd year, stretching across a large section of the bay in a configuration that the program's environmental review had determined would have minimal impact on existing ecological function. He had read the review. It was thorough. The modeling was competent. He had nothing specific to object to. He had noticed, during the installation, that the long lines were going into a section of the bay where his dive logs showed the densest concentration of juvenile Dungeness crab habitat. He made a note of this. He did not say anything to anyone because he wasn't certain what he was noting, and because his observation that this specific section had historically held a lot of juvenile crabs did not constitute evidence of anything except that was good ground. He had been wrong before about what his observations meant. 3 seasons ago, he had become convinced that a thermal anomaly he'd been tracking in the bay's northern arm was linked to a change in the outer coast upwelling pattern. He had spent time on that theory. He had been wrong. The anomaly resolved itself naturally by autumn and was almost certainly a localized summer phenomenon with no broader significance. He remembered that season when he felt the urge to say something. He kept diving. He kept writing. The cormorant count dropped in the first season, not dramatically, from 912 birds at the peak count to 740. He noted it without attaching significance because bird populations fluctuated. He had seen lower counts in years when forage fish ran thin, and he had seen higher counts in years when conditions were exceptional. 740 was low, but not alarming. The following season, the count was 419. He stood at the point with his binoculars and counted them twice. The birds were there in the bay. He could see them work in the water outside the long line array, just not in the numbers they had used in previous seasons. Not here, in the bay where their colony had been established for as long as he had a record of it. He wrote it in his dive log. He spent that winter going back through everything, his own logs, his father's salmon records, the pattern of what he knew about this bay across a combined 40 years of documentation. He was looking for precedent, for any season that showed a similar cormorant decline and what had accompanied it. He found one. A single season, 1974, in his father's logs. His father had not kept formal bird counts, but he had noted, in the margin of a spring entry, cormorant scarce this spring. Bay bottom fouled near the Mussel test site. They cleaned it out last fall. Birds came back by June. Mussel test site. There had been experimental aquaculture installation in this bay in the 1970s, small and short-lived, removed when the economic projections didn't materialize. Rowan had known about it vaguely. He had not connected it to anything. He sat with that margin note for a long time. Then he took his dive gear down to the bay and made a series of dives directly under the new longline array. What he saw was not what he had expected to see. He had expected, from his dive logs, a bottom dominated by the gravelly substrate that made this section good juvenile crab habitat. Mixed gravel and shell hash, the kind of irregular surface where small crabs found shelter and forage fish could hunt at depth. What he found instead was a continuous layer of fine organic material settling on and into the gravel, covering the substrate with a soft accumulation that had not been there 18 months before. Mussel biodeposits. The accumulated material shed by millions of filter-feeding mussels, shell fragments, fecal pellets. The fine organic detritus that fell continuously from every mussel on every line, 24 hours a day, in quantities that the individual mussel may look negligible and that millions of mussels made into something substantial. He photographed it with his underwater camera and surfaced. He told himself he might be wrong about what it meant. He had seen unusual bottom conditions before that cleared up with seasonal current changes. He had seen turbidity events that deposited material temporarily and then removed it when the currents shifted. What he was seeing might be temporary. The accumulation might have a natural removal mechanism he hadn't accounted for. He made a note in his dive log. Significant biodeposit layer under the longline array. Need to determine if this is seasonal or accumulating. He made additional dives every 3 weeks for the rest of the season. The layer was not seasonal. It was accumulating. He brought his concerns to the aquaculture program's first annual environmental review meeting, held the following spring at the community hall. He described the cormorant count decline from over 900 to under 500 across 2 seasons. He described the biodeposit accumulation under the longline array. He showed his dive log entries with the photographs attached. The program's environmental monitor, a careful man named Holloway, listened to the full presentation. He acknowledged the cormorant observation as concerning and said he would flag it for the program's ornithological consultant. He said the biodeposit accumulation was within the model parameters for the scale of mussel operation, that the review had anticipated organic deposition, and had projected natural dispersal mechanisms sufficient to prevent persistent accumulation. Rowan said the dispersal wasn't happening at the rate the model projected. Holloway said the review's modeling had been based on current velocity data from 3 seasonal monitoring deployments, which was a standard baseline for this type of project. Rowan said the current velocity in that section of the bay was lower in summer, which was when the accumulation was building most quickly. Holloway said the program would review that data and get back to him. Rowan thanked him and left the meeting. He drove home along the coast road and thought about what his father had said about the cormorants. Those birds of the bay's fishing report. The report was getting worse. He spent the following weeks trying to determine what the cormorants were telling him. Specifically, they were diving birds. They pursued forage fish. If they had left the bay or reduced their use of it dramatically, either the forage fish they pursued had declined or the forage fish had moved to a location the cormorants preferred over the bay's interior. He watched where the birds were working. They were present in the bay, outside the longline array, and along the northern shore. They were largely absent from the interior where the array was. He made more dives. This time he covered a wider area, not just under the array, but along the bay's shallows, where the native eelgrass grew and where his log showed juvenile Dungeness crabs and forage fish had historically concentrated. The eelgrass was changing. The inner edge of the eelgrass bed, the section closest to the mussel array, was showing the same kind of fine sediment coverage that he had documented under the long lines. The biodeposit material was not staying under the array. It was distributing into the adjacent habitat when the current ran against the array's long axis, carrying fine particles into the shallows. This had not been in the review's modeling, but he was not sure yet whether the eelgrass coverage change was significant, or whether it was within a range of normal variation that eelgrass beds experience seasonally. He had good dive logs, but his observation of eelgrass specifically had not been as systematic as his bottom condition notes. He was working from a general impression against a general impression, which was not evidence of anything except that he should pay closer attention. He told himself he might be reading causation into correlation. The seal population had been increasing in this bay for several years, and seals competed directly with cormorants for the same fish species. He had seen several seals work in the interior section of the bay in the same season the cormorant count dropped. It was not impossible that the seal pressure was a dominant factor. He spent the autumn watching seals. He began keeping a separate daily count, not just when he was on the water, but from the shore at the point, morning and evening, recording every seal he could identify in the bay's interior. He built a map of their movement patterns across tidal cycles, noting where they concentrated and when. The data was clean and consistent. The seals were using the bay heavily, and they were concentrated in the same section where the cormorant ewes had declined. The correlation was exactly what he would have expected if seal competition was a primary driver of the cormorant decline. He was aware of this as he built the dataset, that he was accumulating evidence that supported a theory he was already considering, which was the most dangerous kind of data collection, the kind that confirmed rather than tested. He made himself run the numbers for adjacent bays before he concluded anything. He borrowed monitoring data from a researcher he knew at the State Fisheries Office and cross-referenced cormorant observations from 2 nearby bays with similar seal pressure. By the following spring, he had documented seal activity in the bay carefully enough to take it to a researcher. He found a marine mammal biologist at the State University who agreed to look at his data. The biologist said his seal counts were consistent with what she was seeing at monitoring sites across the region. Seal populations were recovering throughout this coastal area, but she said something that made him stop. She said that cormorant populations in adjacent bays with similar or higher seal pressure were not showing the decline pattern he had documented here. He said, "So the seals aren't the primary cause." She said, "Not in isolation, no." He said he had a theory about the Mussel farm's biodeposit accumulation affecting the eelgrass, which affected the juvenile crab and forage fish population, which affected the cormorants. She said that was a reasonable hypothesis. He said he wasn't sure how to test it. She said she knew someone who might be able to help. The researcher she connected him with was a graduate student at the School of Aquatic and Fisheries Sciences named Anika Larson, who was studying coastal habitat feedback loops and was immediately interested in what Rowan's dive log showed. She came out twice that spring, diving with him and examining the bay floor at multiple points. What she found matched the progression his logs had documented, a gradient of biodeposit accumulation moving from highest directly under the long line array to diminishing but still measurable levels in the adjacent eelgrass shallows. She spent most of the second dive at the eelgrass zone, pulling small cores and examining the substrate carefully with an underwater magnifier, working slowly in the way of a scientist who does not want to miss something by hurrying. Rowan watched her work the way his father used to watch things he didn't yet understand, with the patience of someone who had decided that watching was a correct response until he understood enough to do something else. The eelgrass in the affected zone showed reduced shoot density and reduced rhizome mass, early indicators of stress that wouldn't show up as visible die-off for another season or two, but that her sampling methodology could identify now. She said, "If this accumulation continues at the current rate, this eelgrass section will experience significant die-off within 2 growing seasons. That section provides nursery habitat for juvenile Dungeness crab and is a primary feeding area for the forage species of cormorants are pursuing." Rowan said, "And my father's 1974 note says the cormorants came back when the Mussel test site was cleaned out." Larson asked to photograph the 1974 entry. He showed her his father's salmon log, the margin note in the spring entry. She photographed it and then stood there reading it a second time. She said, "This is what we needed, a precedent. Without this, we have a correlation that could be disputed. With this, We have documentation that the same pattern was observed in this bay, with a similar installation, 50 years ago, with the same recovery following removal. He said his father hadn't known it would matter. He'd written it as a curiosity. She said that was usually how the important ones worked. Larson's formal findings went to the state aquaculture program as part of a supplementary environmental assessment requested by the Coastal Management Office after Rowan's formal complaint. The assessment documented the biodeposit accumulation, the eelgrass stress indicators, and the cormorant population decline across 3 seasons, and included a section on historical precedents citing the 1974 salmon log entry. The program did not end the mussel farm. The economics were real and the community need was genuine, and there was a responsible path forward that didn't require eliminating something that was otherwise working. What the program did require was a redesigned array. The long lines were redistributed across a wider footprint at lower density per unit area, reducing the biodeposit accumulation beneath any single section to levels within the natural dispersal capacity of the bay's current. The interior section, the one Rowan's dive log showed as a highest density juvenile crab and forage fish habitat, was left without long lines entirely, a protected zone recognized in the modification agreement as a biologically sensitive area. The modification took 18 months to design and implement. During that time, Rowan continued diving. He documented the eelgrass stress progression every 3 weeks, the way he had documented everything in this bay, methodically, without editorializing, writing what he saw and comparing it to what he had seen before. The die-off that Larson had predicted arrived in the second summer, affecting approximately 40% of the stress section, the worst it concentrated in the zone, directly adjacent to where the interior long lines had been densest. He wrote it in his dive log without drama. Depth, coverage estimate, comparison to the previous season's entry, estimated timing of recovery if the redesigned array was performing as projected. He had been watching this bay for 28 years. He knew how bays healed, and he knew that patience was not a feeling but a practice. The ongoing decision to keep documenting and keep trusting that the record would be useful even when you couldn't see how yet. The cormorant count in the second full season after the redesigned array went into operation was 683 birds. He stood at the point and counted them twice, the way he always did. 683. Not back to the pre-farm numbers, but meaningfully up from 419. He wrote it in his log. He noted the date, the weather, the tide stage, the count at 3 reference points along the colony area. Then he wrote one more line, the kind his father might have written in the margin, almost as an afterthought. Birds coming back. Bay finding its balance again. Slow work. He closed the log. He thought about his father standing at this same point years ago, pointing to the colony and explaining that the birds were the bay's fishing report. He thought about the salmon logs in the garage drawer, kept for 40 years, the margin note from 1974 written in a season when aquaculture tests had fouled the bottom and the cormorants had stayed away until someone cleaned it up. His father had not known he was writing something that would matter. He had simply been paying attention, recording what the bay showed him, because that was what you did when you worked a body of water you cared about. The cormorants were back in larger numbers. Not all the way back. Getting there, the bay was doing what bays did when the conditions were right, healing in the direction of itself at its own pace, on its own schedule, indifferent to anyone's timeline except its own. Rowan put the log in his jacket pocket and walked back to the boat. The water was gray and moving in a particular way it moved on this kind of late autumn morning, the kind that made everything else feel like it could wait. It could wait. The bay was working.